يا هلا 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 حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the program. It's a Wednesday morning and you're watching Let's Talk with me, Julie Alli. We're coming through to you live from our Sunning Hill studios in Johannesburg. This is ITV Networks. Great to be with you, and we do hope you'll keep us company right up until 10 o'clock. We're looking at a whole host of issues today. We're going to be looking air traffic control. We'll be talking Corruption Watch with David Lewis, and it is also Mental Health Awareness Month. So we're going to be looking at mental health from a slightly different perspective. We're going to talk about occupational therapy and the importance of OT in mental health management. Our first guest to talk us through these issues is Nilofa Khan, and she is a qualified occupational therapist. If you have any questions or comments, do remember our lines will be open throughout the show, and let's get the show on the road. Nilofa, assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam, Auntie Julie. Jazakallah for having me.
Lovely to have you here. And when I think OT, I think of so many different aspects of OT, or so many different modalities that you guys obviously address as far as OT is concerned. But because it is mental health awareness, we do want to concentrate on that part of OT. I have in previous programs focused a lot on children, or the value of OT in children's therapy. For Mental Health Awareness Day or month, and issues around how and how much of a role would an occupational therapist play in the rehabilitation of mental health patients?
The role that we play is actually quite vast and quite realistic, I would say. We take things for granted, things that we actually carry out in our everyday lives, such as your activities of daily living. So that's looking at your work, your leisure, sleeping routines, self-care, and those are the things that directly influence or affect a patient's mental health status, especially when they're diagnosed. So our role specifically in that is trying to form or give routine for these patients and try to maximize their potential within their activities, so that we can try and improve their dignity and provide them with that sense of empowerment of their lives.
And if we don't do that, Nilofa, obviously they are going to be slipping possibly into depression or into a state of helplessness.
Definitely. So a lot of the mental health conditions you see, depression is quite strong, stress management, just self-awareness, self-esteem, and living in the society that we do, the amount of pressures that we're faced with, anyone is actually prone to a mental illness, but it's something that's not spoken about or admitted or respond. So as we sit here today, we all have our own stresses, but it's the distinction between having a stress and how you're going to cope with it that will lead to a mental illness. And that, I think, is something that people need to be very aware of. So when you're faced with a stressful circumstance or situation, people no, it's something that will pass, but you need to be aware of those warning signs, like the lack of sleep, or sleeping too much, or the loss of appetite, or the inability to carry out things that you would usually find enjoyable, or even just doing or having control of your daily activities of daily living.
Now, we're going to be a little all over the place with the interview this morning. I know we spoke mental health awareness and how you as an OT plays a part in rehabilitating the patient or making the patient's life a little more comfortable. But when you talk OT, you're talking pediatric OT, you're talking geriatric OT, you're also talking mental health and OTs. Let's look at geriatrics and let's not confuse the issue. I'm certain as an OT you will agree with me, as you grow older, you do slow down.
Definitely.
And your fine, I should imagine, your fine motor skills also possibly is compromised.
Yes.
Would you then work with older patients, senior citizens, and help them to relearn or better master, maybe buttoning up their shirts, etc.? And what other challenges would older people have?
So I think our main focus as occupational therapists in geriatric care is optimizing on the functioning that the patient already has, and then also giving them sort of that reason to live. So reminding them that they actually still have a purpose and a role. And then, like you said, providing reasonable accommodations within their home environment, or be it to assist them with dressing. So I think it's just facilitating a program that's well structured and run. So be it in an institute, or even just be it a patient that's living within their home environment with their loved ones. So just trying to facilitate that process for them, just to make them feel included in their everyday activities, but also not giving them that sense of hopelessness which they are feeling towards the end of their life, but feeling or helping them achieve that goal of satisfaction that one may feel towards the end. So we're looking at helping them dress, looking at assisted devices, techniques to maximize their potential and independence, as well as their burden of care. Because I think as a person gets older, you do stress or worry that I don't want to be a burden on my family. So just reminding them that they have the potential to achieve anything that they actually put their mind to, but just serving as that motivation. But also giving them a lot of recreational activities. So for us, work would be going to a job. For a geriatric care patient, it would be something like baking or cooking, or finding their interest that will actually give them active engagement.
You spoke about stress. You also touched on depression a little earlier on, and I want to talk about those issues with mental health patients and with older people, your geriatric patients. It's very, very important because I'm not quite sure which comes first. Probably the lack of exercise, which I should imagine is really very important, because if you don't have enough exercise and you start becoming a couch potato,
definitely,
you're going to start slipping into depression. Talk us through that and the importance of exercise, and at what stage or age should one start upping the exercise so that you don't find that when you're older your muscles just ain't working any longer.
Yeah. So I would think from that perspective, ideally a physiotherapist would be ideal for it. But within occupational therapy, we also do relaxation exercises. But I would just think any person to take at least 10 minutes a day to try and do brisk movements and exercise, be it jogging on the spot or skipping or just taking a walk in the garden, that actually does so much for oneself. You don't realize how much you can collect your thoughts in that time, or you can actually release those stresses. But ideally, from a younger age, it's preferable, but as you get older, to try and increase that time, because you probably have a lot more time on your hands. It'll be really great for your mental health and well-being, as well as your physical status. Unfortunately, when we think of old age, we automatically first instinctively think a physical condition, and little do we realize the mental effect that actually takes control of your body and your status. So sometimes you may be physically fit, but you may actually have a mental health condition such as depression, or thinking about what is my family going to do when I'm gone, or how am I going to cope with letting go. Yeah, those types of things.
And it works two ways, doesn't it? If you are depressed, you're going to stop taking care of yourself.
Definitely.
And then you're sitting with a double whammy. Yeah. It's the depression and physical issues. Yeah. Or if you've hurt yourself in an accident, or if you've just, if you're osteoporotic, or and your bones have become very brittle, you've got to be extra careful.
Yes.
So because there's a lot of focus on your physical health and well-being, you could possibly slip into depression as well, because you're worrying what's going to happen to me. Yeah. So it's really a double-edged sword, so to speak. Yeah. You've got to be so diplomatic how you broach the subject with this type of a patient, and also I wouldn't say burden, but the extra responsibility to the caregivers or the loved ones. How do we best broach this issue?
I think it's also just firstly addressing the issue of the stigma around it, and then helping the family understand the condition that the patient or their loved one is actually suffering with. Once you get the buy-in from that, then you get the responsibility that they take ownership or actions first individually for the patient and then addressing the family members. But at the same token, also the family members need to go through a process of psychology as well, because they're having to deal with their own personal issues of how this is going to play an impact on their life, or having to perceive a person in a certain way and now all of a sudden there's a change. So I think with a lot of that, from an occupational therapy point of view, we do a lot of psychoeducation, and that focuses on just explaining the diagnosis, reiterating to the family of how they roll and what they need to do to facilitate better outcomes, especially functional outcomes for their patient or their loved one.
We are talking a lot of responsibility as far as the caregiver or the family is concerned. They too, they need some form of counselling to be able to deal with the patient, with their loved one, and not lose patience. And they too need care, because you don't want them slipping into depression. But more about that right after the ad break. I'm talking to Nilofa Khan, who's an occupational therapist. We're focusing on OT today simply because it is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we want to spotlight that if a patient, an older person or a person who has suffered from a stroke, if they are not well supported from every aspect, they're going to become stressed and depressed, and you as the caregiver is going to have that much more of a burden to be carrying around. So please stay listening and watching this morning. If you have any questions or comments, we're happy to take your calls right after the ad break. Now, it's not only Mental Health Awareness Month, it's also Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And OTs play a huge role in both areas. They also play a big role with stroke patients. And we know, my perception of OT was that they just work with children who possibly suffer from ADHD. But Nilofa has told me that it's a very, very, very wide field, and it truly assists many people in therapy and in recovery. Nilofa, I touched on breast cancer, mental health, and children with ADHD, so a whole host of issues as far as your response is concerned. Shall we start with breast cancer patients, people who've probably had a mastectomy or have had chemo or radiation? Do they need any form? I know that physiotherapy is indicated, but what about OT?
So within the scope of OT, we can also play a role with just the psychological aspects as well as the physical. So the physical aspects would be lymphedema massage, but that's more post-grad course, which physios and occupational therapists both do. Because of the whole chemo process as well as the mastectomy, you usually get a lot of swelling in the body around the breast area, the arms, the legs. So the lymphedema massage actually helps to facilitate the reduction of the swelling for the patients. But in the aspects of a mental health view for patients with breast cancer or any chronic illness, we're just to help them change their mindset and their ability. So they're going to go through the different phases of denial, and then you're going to try and equip them with the coping mechanisms and skills to be able to facilitate better functional outcomes for themselves.
The coping mechanisms you talk about, I should imagine, are lifestyle changes, number one, and those lifestyle changes really is about gentle exercise routines.
Yes, definitely. So just having a well-balanced diet, very important, as well as incorporation of exercises, but trying to facilitate definitely a distinction between when there's time for work and relaxation, because in this day and age everything is just so fast-paced that we actually forget to take that time out for ourselves and just stop. And when I mean take time out for yourselves, for a working mom, I don't mean seeing to your kids or addressing their needs and issues or your loved ones, but just doing something personally for yourself that's going to give you satisfaction and a downtime that'll give you that relaxation.
It doesn't matter what form of an illness or difficulty or challenge your loved one is facing. If you are the primary caregiver, it does take its toll on you.
Definitely.
And if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to obviously transfer those feelings of anxiety, guilt, and all those negative feelings is going to be transferred to the patient, and they're not going to be comfortable at all.
Not
it's
at
going
all.
to hamper their healing. Am I right?
Definitely. So I always remind my patients that they say, I can't do this because I'm the sole breadwinner, like you say, or the caregiver of the family. But I always remind them that if you're not okay, how do you expect the rest of them to be okay? So in order to facilitate a better, harmonious environment for yourself and your loved ones, start with yourself, and you'll instinctively start seeing that ripple effect with the rest of the family.
I guess there's no gentler or a better situation to be in, or a softer situation to be in. Mental health is mental health, or if you're working, if a family member needs support in terms of occupational therapy, it still is a responsibility, and you need to do it with love and care. But let's look at the issue around a mental health care patient. How much more work is involved there? Would you say it's different from patient to patient? Would it depend on the degree of the condition that they're suffering from? And obviously, everybody expects a good outcome. Would you be able to say that you have good outcomes with mental care patients, or are they just that much more challenging to work with?
I think having locumed as well, while still working in the public sector, I locum for a psychiatric institute, and working with the patients there, it's actually very physically and mentally taxing on yourself as a therapist, because you take in a lot of the things, and then you realize that you actually need to go for counseling yourself to offload. But in the same token, you definitely see positive outcomes, especially if the environmental factors influence them in a positive way. So social circumstances play a huge role and factor. The family support, that feeling of loneliness is very great in mental health, with all of the conditions on the spectrum. So just knowing that that mental health patient has that support and that structure sort of gives you more of, a positive outcome, or acknowledge that this patient would be supported in the appropriate ways.
How do you assist with stroke patients? Is it, can you hope for a better outcome if you start working with a patient shortly after they've suffered the stroke? And the expectations, are you able to help them meet, the family's expectations about the recovery of the patient?
Definitely. I think we always reinforce that home programs are very essential for them to carry out at home, but predominantly with stroke patients, that window period of 6 months is very, very crucial. So especially if a patient has suffered a stroke and you get a referral of a doctor to visit a therapist, be it occupational therapy or physiotherapy, take that action to actually go and see the therapist, because that window period is so crucial, and that's when you can actually gain the functionality. I can't say 100% in most cases, but better functional outcomes for that individual.
Now, when you work with children, it doesn't matter what the issue is. It may be ADHD, or maybe anything else, low tone, as you explained to me off air just now. You indicated that with children, you would work with them for approximately 6 months, and then they're good to go. The same can't be said for mental care patients, can it? I mean, because in most cases, I should imagine, and geriatric patients, is they forget.
Definitely.
They forget what you've, taught them, or how you've worked with them. So it's almost like having to start from scratch every time you see them.
Yeah, definitely. So from the memory point of view, as an occupational therapist, you'll always provide activities, not just verbally, you'll always do demonstration, handwriting, as well as reminders around the home. So for a patient with like dementia or Alzheimer's,
that must be very difficult.
Exceptionally. So you want to give them physical reminders that then when they see it, they will acknowledge it, and then they would be able to carry out whatever they needed to for that day.
How important is it, for patients who suffer from dementia, that they have regular physio and occupational therapy? Because if they don't have those form of interventions, what's the outcome going to look like for them?
I think it's very difficult for a patient or someone who's living with a patient with dementia or Alzheimer's, because you're having that severe memory loss, disorganized thinking. You also get psychomotor behavior, slurred speech, loss of language. So that impact that basically the patient can't function. So the things that we put in place is definitely regular exercises from a physiotherapy point of view, or if there's other illnesses that are affecting the patient, like osteoporosis or arthritis, things like that. But from an OT perspective, we focus a lot on activities of daily living, like I said. So giving them that balance of that lifestyle and providing reasonable accommodations within the home environment. And like I said, like giving them those reminders, writing things down, putting notes in areas.
Possibly pictures would also do
Definitely,
help
pictures,
a lot.
yeah. And then also even physically putting up a timetable from 7 to 8, you're going to do bathing, breakfast, grooming, making the bed, things like that. So it's
And
that
it's
detailed.
those simple everyday activities that you're having to reinforce on a regular basis. Because if you don't do that with your geriatric and your mental health patients, they're going to forget and they're going to start neglecting themselves.
Definitely.
And at the end of the day, then the caregivers or the family members are going to have a bigger responsibility or a bigger burden.
Yeah, definitely. So you actually see that burden of care on taking that toll or that impact on the caregivers. But all in so just motivating your patient a lot of the time that it's going to be okay. Some days are going to be fine and some days aren't going to, but just reinforcing and reminding them of that end therapeutic goal. As a therapist, you're always willing to go that extra mile to ensure that this is achieved, as well as to just lessen the burden of care on the caregivers.
Now, I know that you're not in private practice, you work for the state, but let's talk about challenges. And working for the state, I should imagine, exposes you to very many different cases on a daily basis. Challenges, and I should even imagine that some of your frustrations might be that you can't or not able to, because of time constraints, work with the patients on a more regular basis.
Definitely, that's a huge constraint because of our patient turnover, the rate.
And the ratio.
The ratio, and the amount of therapists that we actually get into the public sector. Thankfully for community service, because that actually assists us quite greatly in increasing our staffing numbers. But you would always try and give your best to that patient, even if you're seeing them once a month. But I think in community, or I could say even in hospital, our main focus of therapy is try to impart your knowledge and skills onto the caregiver, and then placing a lot of emphasis on your home programs, because you're only seeing this patient once a month for an hour, versus ideally you would try and see them maybe twice a week. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at the issue around expectations. If you were in private practice, I suppose this would possibly be a scenario. The family comes to you with the patient and you contract and you start working with the patient and the family. Do you discuss expectations? Do you tell them what the possible positive and possible negative outcomes would be? Because if the expectations are too high, they may then cast aspersions on you as an occupational therapist who hasn't delivered what they were expecting or what supposedly you had promised.
Definitely. So I have also worked in private, and with that, I think there's a lot of more expectations because patients are paying for these sessions. But a lot of the time when the patient comes, I think it's first and foremost understanding why they're there, understanding first what is their expectation of you as a therapist, and then working through that and sifting through it to tell them what is realistic goals and what is maybe unrealistic. Because a lot of the time it's almost like I'm bringing my patient or my loved one to you to be, how do I say, made to be 100% okay, but that's not the matter of fact. We're just there as a means to try and provide, how do I say, a balanced lifestyle, or try and help the person cope within their daily activities, and try to maximize their potential. So I think just reiterating that. But like we're speaking about the caregiver, a lot of the time the patient sort of gets lost in translation. So most important, before addressing the caregiver, addressing the patient and just asking them specifically and solely, what do you expect from coming from therapy? And then in that way, just getting buy-in and that ownership and responsibility for their own illness, and then definitely you'll see positive outcomes.
Sadly, in a situation with a mental health care patient, or a very old patient, or a patient with Alzheimer's, they probably don't even understand or would not even know what this interaction is all about. So they're not going to be able to vocalize their expectations at all. So you're going to have to do the best you can under those circumstances, possibly with input from family members.
Definitely. So even though it also depends on the severity of the patient's condition, but a lot of the patients do have a basic understanding that this is what I need to do every day, but they need that structure and supervision, obviously, to put in place. So as an occupational therapist, you always still address it with the patient. You will never disacknowledge their needs and their interests specifically, because occupational therapy is so activity-based. You want to find that just right challenge for your patient. So you'll always do like an interest checklist, or sort of to try and get that buy-in from the patient. So a typical example would maybe be, say, a schizophrenic patient that have the negative influences or the impact that they face with. So they're a lot more depressed, labile, don't have this passion or any motivation to carry out any activities, a simple thing like showering. So you will try and sort of look at their strengths or their areas of interest to sort of get that buy-in for them to engage in therapy and encourage them to come for sessions.
What about a patient who is suffers from bipolar, for example? So they have their highs and their lows, and in their manic phases they have a lot of energy. Can you work with them to help calm them down? I know medication will do the trick, but I mean, you don't want to be solely reliant on medication. But are you able to, as an occupational therapist, to help them calm them down and give them certain specific exercises that will kind of, lower the tone of the activity?
Definitely. So when we speak of exercises, we will be looking at relaxation therapy, meditation, anything that's going to calm them down.
Oh, wow.
But the exercises also doesn't always have to be physical, where let's put our arms out to the side and count to 10, but it can also be activity-based. So something like gardening. So you want to channelize this energy into something that's positive and constructive rather than destructive.
And interesting.
Definitely.
Finally, is occupational therapy a necessity or a nice to have?
I would think it's a necessity, because I think as occupational therapists, we all feel that actually everyone needs occupational therapy in their lives, because it's solely based on your activities of daily living and something that we take for granted. But it's for all ages, and I would say, or stress the emphasis or importance of it to the doctors, because that's our main referral source. So just engaging and just acknowledging what we do as a profession. I always go back on a saying that doctors are able to restore life through the will of God, but what's the use of the life if it can't be lived?
Absolutely, and you're there to help people get the best of their daily lives, even if it's a stay-at-home mom and she's battling, she can't do things that she could do in the past. You'd be able to assess what her surroundings look like, the type of activity she's involved in, and you'd be able to advise and say, this is too strenuous for you, perhaps you should try it this way, or your work surfaces are too high or too low. Would I be right in suggesting all of that?
Yeah.
So it's not only for people who are terminally or very ill or in a bad car accident. It's about everyday living, just to maximize your life to the best of your ability.
Definitely.
Nolofa, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. All the very best, and Hope that we can have you on again sometime soon.
Jazakallah
Go
so much.
well. Assalamu alaikum to you. That was Nilofa Khan. She's an occupational therapist. She works in the public service, talking to us about the importance of OT, and she's just told me now, of course I asked her the question, is OT a necessity or a luxury? And she says, no, very definitely it is a necessity. Still to come, Corruption Watch. David Lewis will be talking to us, and we'll be wrapping up by talking about, of all things, air traffic control. Welcome back. We now talk about the really serious stuff, and of course we know that our country's been riddled with the gravy train, corruption, and all sorts of shenanigans going on in large corporates and of course in governments as well. And you kind of feel helpless, wondering what is it that you can do to stop this scourge that's eating, you know, just trying to. It's crippling South Africa as a country. While you know that we've had OUTA in here a couple of times, they're doing their best to try and stem this sickness, this cancer called corruption. We also have an organization called Save South Africa, and then we have an organization called Corruption Watch. And David Lewis from Corruption Watch is here with us this morning to talk about corruption, obviously. David, morning, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting us.
Should we be worried in South Africa? We have OUTA, we have Save South Africa, and a whole host of other people. Everyone trying to do their bit. How serious is the issue in South Africa? I refer to it as a cancer, but just how serious is it? Do we need organizations such as yourself to try and hopefully turn the tide, if it can be turned?
It's very serious, you know, and in fact, you know, the one factor, there are a number of factors that stop it from being a whole lot worse than it is. The court, the independent courts, the independent media, obviously the constitutional underpinning of our law, but civil society organizations are incredibly important. I mean, you know, what we can't afford to get into is a situation where the South Africans start to accept that corruption is just a way of life that nothing can be done about. There are many countries in that situation, and once you have reached that low point, it's very difficult to turn around. In South Africa, we haven't reached that point. I mean, people are still outraged. No, I don't think so. It's not our response from the public. The public are very outraged. They're willing to be very active in opposing corruption. And that's all to the good, because it's absolutely essential. So I don't think that we've reached a point of no return by any stretch of the imagination.
You know what I'm thinking, David, is there's not a week that goes by that there isn't some scandal or the other as far as corruption is concerned that breaks. So come a Sunday, the Sunday Times, or a Monday morning, you just wait for all the major news medias to start breaking their stories. And not a week goes by when something new doesn't surface.
Yeah, well, that's a good sign. I mean, the take home from that is that these stories are breaking, and that they're still outraging people, and the media consider these stories important enough and newsworthy enough to attract the attention of their readers and their viewers and their listeners. You go to a country like, you know, Russia, India, it takes an absolutely earth-shattering departure from anything they've ever heard of before to actually become a point of public conversation. In South Africa, it's the conversation of the day, and we need to keep it that way, and we need to intensify it. We need people to speak even louder. We need them, if necessary, as is necessary, to take to the streets to oppose corruption. And there is a willingness to do so. I mean, in some other countries, they're ahead of us in opposing corruption. Brazil, a couple of small Latin American countries, but we need to keep this public pressure as strong as it is, even stronger.
So who is David Lewis and the Interest in Corruption Watch? I understand that the organization's about 6 years old,
Yeah.
and you are an NPO.
Yes. Who am I? I've a long period in the 70s and the 80s in the union movement, and then, like many unionists, moved to work in government, which I did for a while, for quite a long while actually. And then my last job in government was as chairperson of the Competition Tribunal, which also deals with a particular form of corruption, with price fixing and collusion. And so, at the end of that, at the end of my term of office there, this seemed like a sort of natural extension of what I'd been doing, and so together with a couple of colleagues, friends, we set up Corruption Watch, and it's been a very successful project. I'm very pleased with how it's gone. I work with about 25 people. Really nice people, very diverse group of people.
Very dedicated, I should
imagine.
imagine.
Yeah, and very dedicated. I mean, very driven by what they see going on in their country and sort of determined to fix it up. So, yeah, that's who we are.
Tell us about some of your successes.
Our successes, our principal success is in keeping this conversation going at the tempo that it is going. And, we're not by any means solely responsible for that. But when you see our media figures, when you see the number of organizations that have started to engage with this post our entry into this world, then I'm very pleased that we've achieved what we've wanted to achieve, because our principal objective is encouraging the public to participate in combating corruption, and I think we've been successful in doing that. As I say, not on our own, but we've been very instrumental in doing that. And in order to do that, we carry out a bunch of activities that encourage people to do it. I mean, we encourage people to report corruption. We've had some successful investigations. We've had people criminally charged. We've had people dismissed from their employment. We also engage in a lot of litigation. And we've had some very successful bouts at litigation. We're very involved in the SASO matter. We've been involved in the question of the public protector's powers. And all of this goes towards encouraging people to see that there is something that can be done about this. I mean, we run a lot of on-the-ground grassroots campaigns. We're very involved with corruption at schools, which our reports show is one of the most vulnerable areas for corruption. And there, the amounts of money involved in each act of corruption is not sort of headline-making stuff, but the sort of human interest in it and the human consequences for ordinary people, children.
And those successes were obviously in the year 2015, I think.
No, we've continued with that. I mean, yes. I mean, now in the schools case, we're very much working with the departments of education to try and, get into the situation where we're not simply exposing corruption, but where we are working with the department to identify vulnerabilities in the system and working to develop the mechanisms to plug those gaps, so that, and particularly to empower school governing bodies so that they can do what we've been doing themselves without our assistance. So our whole project is really about civic participation, to detect and to punish corruption. You need to have whistleblowers. There's no victim easily identified.
I was about to ask you, whistleblowing. People are often afraid of whistleblowing because they're afraid they may be victimized. So how does one, let's assume I have information of deep corruption in a specific government sector, or even in the private sector for that matter. How do I go about blowing the whistle? Whom do I go to? What are the steps I take? And how can I be guaranteed anonymity in, under the circumstances?
Well, if you report to us, you will be guaranteed anonymity. And, you know, you can do that on our website, you can do that in our WhatsApp lines, you can do that by phoning into our office, coming into our office, by phoning our call center, and anonymity will be guaranteed. You know, once you get to the stage where this is being investigated and where you need to confront people with the evidence of corruption, it's difficult to be anonymous in circumstances like that, but we would never do that. We would never reveal anybody's identity without their very express authority and clear understanding of the possible consequences. You know, I think whistleblowers need to be protected, and we do our best to do that. I think whistleblowers are also very courageous people, because even if you're being protected, it's actually not an easy path. And, you know, it's like, you know, in the 70s when people joined the trade union movement, they had no guarantees that they were going to be safe, but they did so because they felt it's a necessary thing to do for their communities, their fellow workers. And I think, you know, that's the attitude that people have got to take, have got to adopt to combating corruption, that you're doing this and it is an act of bravery, even though you can be protected, but you're doing it for you know, not only for yourself, but for a greater good. And so that's what we have to do. That's how serious this problem is.
David, I'm thinking, if I want to blow the whistle on someone, I can't just come to you and say, I think you ought to investigate so-and-so because he or she seems to have come into, is leading a very lavish lifestyle, etc. Whatever my, you know, thoughts are on the matter, I do need to have a bit of evidence, or do I just hand over to you and you guys do all the investigations?
No, we can only, I mean, we get about 150 reports of corruption a week.
Sure.
So we can only investigate a very small fraction of them, and we choose for investigation those that are most likely to produce the kind of result that we're looking for, or that the whistleblower is looking for. And that often depends on the quality of the evidence that we get. So, you know, somebody comes to us and says that she thinks that, or she knows that the school headmaster is stealing money from or food from the school nutritional scheme, feeding scheme. We would want to get as much evidence as we can, but if we decided to investigate that case, we would dig around for further evidence. I mean, but in truth, you know, investigating corruption should be the work of the police, and in fact, our biggest impediment to combating corruption in South Africa is the state of the police and the prosecutorial authorities. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we do investigate. Evidence is important. I mean, you also do get the situation where people maliciously come and report somebody for corruption. We're quite sort of sensitized to when that is happening. And, you know, then we would certainly want further evidence before even capturing it on our database. But you learn about these things.
How closely do you work with Out and Save South Africa and other such interest groups?
We work with a range of interest groups. I mean, you know, we engage with a group like OUTA. We're part of the Save South Africa Coalition. We work with groups like the Right to Know campaign. We've worked with groups like Equal Education. Yeah, we're currently involved in a very big campaign with the Institute of Security Studies around the appointment of a commissioner of police and head of the Hawks. So on a, you know, campaign by campaign basis, we engage with sort of like-minded civil society organizations. But we also work with those in government who are willing to work with us, and we also work with those in the private sector who are willing to work with us. I mean, this is something that no single organization can take on its own. And we find if we're involved in a campaign and around education, we would naturally engage closely with the education institute, the NGOs involved in the field of education. Where we're involved in an issue around the police, then something like the Institute of Security Studies, which is undoubtedly the most expert body on policing in the country, is a natural ally. So it's on an as-need basis, but, you know, very much driven by the principle that we can't do this on our own and nobody can do it on their own. And in civil society organizations, the challenge is always to make very big ripples from actually what is usually a very small stone, you know, cast into a very big pond. And one of the ways of extending those ripples is to work with others. Another way is to do a lot of public communication work, but that's a, you know, persistent challenge. And so we do work. We've done a lot of work with refugees and asylum seekers, for example, and there we work closely with NGOs in that field. So yeah, we're constantly working with other organizations.
Let's wrap up with the all-important question. I think you don't attend any forum or interview without this question being asked. Is the whole Gupta, Eskom, Trillion, that whole saga, are we going to reach a point in South Africa where they're going to be, not forgetting McKinsey and KPMG, and I should imagine there are a whole host of other people that are involved in this smutty, this very dark and murky, you know, shenanigans. But we as South Africans, loyal, hard-working, civil society taxpayers, honest taxpayers, are the Guptas going to be perhaps fined or accounted? Will they be held accountable for all of the monies that has been misappropriated, mismanaged? And at some point, I don't know, I should imagine there's going to be a lot of work involved to try and unravel this whole mess, the sordid mess. But are they going to be held accountable? Are they going to be able, or are we going to ask for them to pay the money back to South Africa?
Well, you know, I think that will come.
Eventually.
I mean, I think, you know, already they're being held accountable. I mean, you know, I wouldn't like to be in the president's shoes or the Gupta shoes right at the moment, or the shoes of the various Trillion executives and the McKinsey executives. We in fact have reported the McKinsey people to the U.S. Department of Justice,
So I understand.
who are very zealous, unlike our organizations. So yes, and you know, freezing the assets of people who have taken illicit money out of the country is one of the things that will happen, and people will go to jail. Obviously, that possibility intersects very closely with what's going on in the governing party. And, at the moment, the governing party is controlled by a clique that is itself very deeply involved in corruption. That's what state capture is all about. And so, depending on what the opposition parties do, depending on what happens in the ANC, whether there's some sort of realignment or some reform of the ANC, which looks increasingly unlikely, but possible, I suppose, it will come sooner or later. But I can see a couple of people who are going to be swapping their smart suits for orange overalls. I mean, there's little doubt about that, I think.
Well, we watch this space with much interest. Thank you indeed for being with us. All I can say is God bless. Continue doing the amazing work that you guys are doing. You are the champions that we need in South Africa. Once again, God bless. Thank you indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
That was David Lewis from Corruption Watch. And, what would we ordinary South Africans do without people like David Lewis, Corruption Watch, Save South Africa, OUTA, etc., etc., etc.? I think what we can do is come out in our masses when we are asked to take to the streets, make our voices heard, and blow the whistle if we think that there's some something fishy, something smelly, something that's untoward in small, large corporates, and even those very powerful families who think that they can capture anything or anybody. Stay with us. We're still going to be talking air traffic control. From occupational therapy to Corruption Watch, and now to air traffic control. Fascinating, isn't it? And I'm even more fascinated because the person we're going to talk to now is the Principal Air Traffic Service Officer. She's a lady and she's Muslim. Layla Hassan, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Lovely to have you here, and it is so mind-blowing knowing that we have our Muslim sisters in a space like this. I never imagined that women and Muslim women would be occupying spaces like these. So when did this all start for you? What were you thinking when you were matriculating and thought, I need to study and I want to go into this field of study?
Well, actually, Julie, the thing is, it started off with me going into university, as every normal child would do. And I started studying accounting sciences. And I realized I'm not the person to be behind a desk and just deal with books and numbers. So, unfortunately, due to my mum passing away, I realized that I had to do something that could keep me a little bit more at home so I could be there for my father and for my brothers. My brother, and just be able to manage the house. And from there I went into beauty and body therapy. And my dad was on holiday in Cape Town one December, and he says, Layla, why don't you try this? I just heard it on the news, and it was about air traffic and navigation services. My passion was always to be a fighter pilot.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, due to the constraints and being from a conservative background, you don't want to push your daughter into that direction. I mean, you're surrounded by men. And South African services, how can I say, with military is a bit tense, So I said, okay, this is the closest I'm going to get. Now, I'm also a very spiritual person. And when you refer to heaven, for example, you always point up. And somehow the clouds always gave me that kind of solace. So I always wanted to be closer to the skies.
Wow.
And I took the opportunity, I applied. And the application process, if I could go through it, was...
Please, because I'm sure there's a lot of young people that
Yes.
are watching us
Yes.
this morning, and if they haven't yet made up their minds what they're going to do next year, post-university or post-matric, inshallah, this might be an avenue they'd like to
Yes.
explore.
So previously, now, everything's gone internet-based, so you can apply over the internet. But the procedure is as such, you need to have your maths and science. Science would be preferable. English, definitely.
Math, science, and
English.
English
Yes.
is a compulsory.
More maths and English. But they do say specify for science as well. It's good to know how to work with
What
numbers.
about geography?
Not so much, because everything that you need to know for this work environment, they teach to you.
Oh, wow, okay.
So you apply as in a bursar program, and you go for what they call psychometric testing. So, of course, your personality is checked, your stress management levels are checked, and also your listening skills are also taken into consideration. And once
That's
you do
crucial,
that,
isn't it?
is,
Because
it
you
is.
could be on duty as an air traffic controller and you
Yes.
miss here and you misdirect, you could have a disaster or a
disaster, that's
catastrophe on
correct.
your hands.
Yes, that's very correct.
Planes colliding with each other on air or possibly crashing to the ground.
Yeah. So what happens is, after you do the psychometrics, once you're successful, you go in for an interview. And from that interview process, then they can always, they let you know that, okay, you're successful, and when do you start? Now, the benefit about being with a company like ATNS is that they pay for the bursary program. So they're paying for your boarding and lodging while you're studying, because of course you need to concentrate. It's 6 months of crucial training now. And they pay for you, they give you the boarding and lodging facilities, you in class from Monday to Friday, and you learn a lot of information in that span of time. Thereafter, they send you for another course. The first course, initial course, is
So
called
that's 6
core
months of
content.
theory, in-class
Of
theory.
That's right. So that's called core content. And then they do what they call an ATS rating course, which is an air traffic service rating course. And basically this gives you the information in the background on how to work with aeronautical information management, which is what every pilot needs to do, or every airline needs to do, in order to ensure that they get their flights in time. So they would have to file a flight plan, for example, via the Aeronautical Information Management Unit that does the flight plan. So the ATS rating course deals with that aspect, so you know where you're starting from. And once you're done with the ATS rating course, they place you in the different airports around the country. Now, ATNS deals with the airspace. So basically, we're using 10%, or we controlling, or I could say own, because that's where we're providing services, 10% of the world's airspace.
Would that be the airspace just covering South Africa?
And
does that belong to us?
yes, and also over the oceans, because we also deal with oceanic airspace.
Of course.
So,
but up to a certain point, obviously.
of course, up to a
because then
certain
you
point.
reach international waters, which...
correct. But remember now, we're not talking about land, we're talking about air. So
Sure.
the airspace is demarcated, and that's the airspace that we currently control.
Which
as
means,
ATNS.
obviously, that if people are going to enter our airspace, they need permission
Yes,
in
that's
advance.
correct. Yes. So that's basically what happens. When they place you into your different units, then, of course, you start climbing. So you learn to do different aspects of it. Remember, the requirements for an air traffic controller is that you need to be very focused. It's a set of skills that you get taught, but it's so specialized that you must be able to do things, how can I say?
Literally in your sleep.
Not only in that way, but you got a headset on, you're speaking to an aircraft on frequency. You need to know what your fellow members are doing. You need to know what your what's happening in your airspace. And of course, you have challenges like maybe congestion on frequency, so you need to be able to listen properly. And of course,
What is congestion of frequencies? I know congestion of airspace when there are a lot of planes hovering in the air, wanting to land because there isn't enough landing space. But what is the frequency issue all about?
So the frequency issue is, on a frequency, you either have a pilot or a controller talking. You can't have both talking simultaneously. So the pilot talks, the controller listens, the controller talks, the pilot listens. But sometimes in an airspace like what we refer to as flight information airspace, that's basically the lower levels where the controller will actually provide traffic information to the pilots. And because there's so many smaller aircraft that are flying around, it's a lot of the pilots will tend to speak continuously.
That can be very dangerous, can't it?
It
And
can.
what about, does your industry also have the threat of hackers who could try and hack into the system and mislead pilots, causing a crash, in terms of possibly terrorist activities?
Not actually. I've never heard of that scenario happening.
It's probably
But our
very classified.
Yes, our systems are based on air traffic management. So it's not a system where you can just log in onto a computer and start working, because then we would be able to work from home, which would be brilliant. But it's not a hackable system, through my understanding of it. Security is very high, of course. And there's a lot of, how can I say, a normal person wouldn't be able to go on frequency and just start talking, because we use a different type of
Technology.
language as well. So just depending on what it is, but I haven't heard of a hacker situation. And so far in South Africa, we're quite safe. With regards to terrorism, they normally attack more the pilots or the airline itself instead of coming to the air traffic control tower as such. Yeah.
How long have you been in the industry?
I started off with HNS in 2007.
So you're there 10 years now.
Approximately 10 years, that's correct.
What exactly is your role, your designation?
Okay, I'm an air traffic service officer, but being a principal air traffic service officer, I basically manage other air traffic service officers that are basically trained to my standard, but it just gives me an additional leg into management of the organization, if you get what I'm saying. So it's operational, so I work on position A as well as assist with the management of the staff.
Your ideal candidate, you've indicated about, being a strong, healthy, well-versed young person. They'll give you the necessary training. You must be able to do active listening.
That's correct.
So all of those are a non-negotiable. How do they ensure that the people that they have chosen to manage this very, very important position, that they're okay? I'm thinking in terms of regular health checks, keeping, the finger on the pulse as, we all have issues in our home lives, our marriages, our children. And if you're not in the right frame of mind, you could be a potential... there is the potential for you to make mistakes, and a very costly and devastating mistake. So how does the human resources at your company, in your organization, keep their finger on the pulse on those issues?
Okay, the thing is with when a person applies to HNS, of course the first level that they go through is the psychometric testing. They also need to be medically fit. And for a person that's already employed by the company and already an air traffic controller or air traffic service officer, every 2 years we do a medical check.
2 years?
2 years. And that is a requirement from the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa. And we're also licensed by that. But say, for example, if a situation has arisen, whether a person met up in an accident before arriving to work or whatever it may be, we are very open-minded to the fact that, okay, the person is in a situation, will they be able to manage, won't they be able to manage, and we would, if they have to come in for a particular shift, we would actually cover the shift to make sure that that person is okay. We also have in the organization something to do with the employee wellness. So it's an employee wellness. So if you are suffering from anything, maybe a death in the family or anything of that sort, you can always contact them, speak to someone about it. And that is all under the cost of the company.
Okay, we're going to talk more about, it sounds like an extremely stressful situation. Yes. It is an extremely stressful situation, knowing that you have the lives of millions of people in your hands, you know, on a regular basis. So how do you cope with the stress? I know you spoke about employee wellness, but let's look at other issues that impact on you as a person and the type of support you need. And we'll talk more about this as a career option when we get back from the ad break. Layla Hassam is our guest in the studio, a Muslim lady, a young Muslim lady holding a top job like this in a top organization. And I'm just absolutely fascinated. Guys, wake up and smell the roses the girls are overtaking. Stay with us. We're going to play we're going to take an ad break. When we get back, we'll continue this discussion. And if you have any questions or comments in terms of this as a possible position or a possible area that you'd like your children or perhaps even yourself to go into, you can call in. Layla's here to take your calls. We're talking to Layla Hassam. She has a very interesting life. She is the principal air traffic service officer. She works at the airport, or well, rather, she's based at OR Tambo. And she says that this was a passion of hers. She wanted to be close to the heavens, and this is where she's landed up. Please stay watching closely if you have a child or a loved one whom you're hoping to perhaps suggest this to as a career option. Layla's been telling me off air that there are lots and lots and lots of opportunities in this area. She's also said there's lots of Muslim and Muslim women all around the country that work for the organization. So lots of opportunities. That's good news, isn't it?
Yes, brilliant news.
And of course, like you said, it's a bursary program. You don't have to go to university.
Correct.
You sign up for 6 months. If you qualify, obviously, on your psychometric test and other tests that they do, then you're well on your way.
Correct, yes.
Okay, what are the duties of an air traffic controller? You know, I love watching Ultimate Airports Dubai, and
yes.
I'm absolutely fascinated. I can't believe how precise, you know, the airports and the people working there, they're like well-oiled machines. They are so, it's run on absolute precision. And you have to be that type of person. You've got to be very orderly, organized, on the ball, be able to work under stress and pressure.
That's correct. When you're talking about Airports Dubai, for example, that is working more with the terminal buildings, with the baggage people and with where the passengers go. We are technically based between the two runways. So we're controlling the airspace. And the job of an air traffic controller is to ensure that the flow of traffic is safe, expeditious, and orderly.
But each and every one of that component is important and makes that wheel turn.
That's
you
correct.
need each and every one of those players to make things happen, as it is with you. And if you guys don't do your job, you could have a catastrophe.
That's correct.
So what exactly does a working day look like?
All right, so a working day would look like you signing on to position. First, you need to read up all the information that you're going to be working with. So if there's anything that's unserviceable and that's going to affect your position, you need to know about those things.
For example?
If you are sitting on a position let's say you're going to be working on a frequency and your normal routing is via a particular point, and that particular point is maybe unsurfaceable. You need to know about those things and how to route the aircraft via different points, for example, if necessary. So that's where it starts off. Then you get into position. The environment of the air traffic controller, the air traffic service officer, is very diverse. So there's, if for example you are taking a flight from here to Durban, there's going to be various controllers that the pilot is going to speak to. So first the pilot will be in the parking bay, in the aircraft, with the passengers loading or still loading on board. And the first position that they speak to is what's called clearance delivery. So clearance delivery will give them the correct, how can I call this, instrument departure to take. And also, if there's anything else, the frequency that they need to contact for the approach controller. Once the aircraft is fully packed and they're ready to go, they will then move on to the ground controller. So the ground controller is responsible for pushing them out of their parking bay.
And are you all sitting in the same space?
This is all happening in the tower at this moment in time.
Okay.
So the ground
tower
controller
with
is
all
just
those big windows.
That's correct.
Okay,
yes.
great.
So so the ground controller will then take them from the parking bay to the holding point of the runway. And then you go to a tower controller, which then departs the aircraft. And then they speak to an approach controller, which then climbs them higher and then hands them over to an area controller. And the area controller then hands them onto the next area sector, where again they'll, on the descent, speak to another approach controller, and then finally to
That's on the
tower.
approach in Durban.
That's correct. Approach in Durban, and then to the tower in Durban, where they land and go back into the parking bay.
How long were you involved in this type of work? You've now moved on into a management role, but how long were you in this type of work, and was the adrenaline really pumping when you were, engaging with the pilots either on takeoff or landing?
I wouldn't say the adrenaline is pumping, because it's an air traffic controller, so of course we need to be in control of the situation. Not that we're always in control, because you always have weather and issues like that can affect your control, but you always have to be composed. You have to be able...
Never mind how your heart is pumping.
You have to be composed, you have to be able to do your job, and your frequency gets busy. So you can't be like, okay, now I'm tired now, I'm done. You've got to be able to push through all of that. And that's actually where the fun part is. And there was one of my instructors at the academy that actually asked, how do you know if a person is passionate about aviation? And they said, let a Boeing 747 land and bring up all the Ferraris and Bentleys in front of them revving. Where their attention is where the passion is. And automatically, if you look at 99% of the controllers, they're looking at the aircraft that's landing.
Okay.
That's the passion.
Did you ever have any near misses or any near disasters while you were an air traffic controller? And what did you do under the circumstances?
Okay, in an air traffic service officer position, on clearance delivery, we issuing clearances. And if you give a wrong clearance, that aircraft might take the wrong turn. So the pilot is listening to you. The pilot is going to comply with what you're telling him to do. And if you, by mistake, give a wrong clearance, and he's supposed to take a left turn and he goes a right turn, and the approach controller might not be aware that this is the clearance given to him, what could happen is they could have a mid-air. So in a situation where it does happen, where you pick up, oh no, I gave the wrong frequency, or the wrong SID, for example, which 90% of the time doesn't happen. But if it does happen, then you can always call the pilot back before he gets airborne and tell him, please correct this. Or your colleagues are sitting next to you. Please just re-clear the guy. I gave him the wrong clearance.
Is that a bad mark on your record if you've given the wrong instruction or the wrong clearance? What happens after, and you correct it, you pick up on it, and then after your shift is over, I presume you do you file a report?
You file a report if it's necessary, but the main thing is with my staff is if they know that they had a situation and position, they'll come and talk to me. Or they'll call me and they'll say, this is what happened, I don't know what happened, this is the mistake I made. And we would coach them and assist them in getting through that. It might be a slight problem on the way of understanding, or it might be that they were just stressed or something happened at that time, that they couldn't contain the situation, for example, and maybe issued the wrong clearance, for example. Then we would discuss that, And
what is the margin of error in a situation like this? I should imagine 0. or 0.0.
0.02%.
if someone presents a little higher than that, do you then take them in for extra training, or do you remove them from that situation? Because we're talking millions of lives here on an annual basis. What do you do in a situation like that? When and how do you pick up that someone's having problems, they're making one too many mistakes?
If it arises in that situation, automatically being in a controller or an air traffic service officer position, you know when you're not working to the best of your ability. And automatically, because we have this culture of taking responsibility for your actions, you automatically will go to your manager and say, listen, this is the situation, this is how I'm feeling, I feel I need some time, or whether it's time off, whether it's counseling, whatever it may be. But if a situation arises where there is a near miss, if I can put it in that way, we provide what they call CISM, which is Critical Incident Management or Stress Management. So like how you get your post-traumatic stress disorder, it basically would help to contain that before it gets further. So you would speak to the person, ask them what they're feeling, what was the external contributions, what were the internal contributions. And the thing is, a lot of the times when an incident happens with an air traffic controller, they look at the situation and they were like, I had a feeling. So it's always about a sixth sense.
Okay, your gut.
Your gut.
Okay, we've come to the end of the show. Let's talk about why would you advise young people to go in this area of work, number one? And is there, in terms of age, a cutoff point?
The beginning age, of course, when you want to apply to ATNS, you must be 18 years or older. Cutoff point, depending, because on your abilities, of course. It depends on how you're doing your psychometric testing. The thing is...
That's every 2 years they check?
No, the psychometric testing is before you do the interview process.
No, that's a one, or is it just a once-off? Don't they check you every 2 years?
No, the 2 years is a medical.
Okay.
So depending if you fill in the criteria, there are many opportunities left. But remember your age for and the concentration needed for an air traffic controller is very high. So even though our normal retirement age is between 55 and 65, those controllers have the experience, and those controllers would normally go into the ATA to give the experience to other students that are starting off. So I wouldn't say there's a specific cutoff date, but of course, if you must be able to leave your home for 6 months to do the training.
Okay, and there's also this work is shift work, so you work all sorts of hours.
That's correct.
But I understand the pay is pretty good.
The pay, shukr alhamdulillah, it's doable. I mean, if you're looking at a person that's out of university, their beginning salary is starting at approximately 4, you're getting double of what they would get once you go permanent.
Okay. Just in closing, you've talked about all of the highlights. What are the things to look out for? The challenges?
The challenges, of course, like I've mentioned, it's the frequency, but the frequency congestion is one thing, but the main thing that you need to be very self-aware. You need to be very in tune with yourself to say, okay, am I fit enough to do this today? Or do I have something that might cause me to miss something in my shift, or whatever it may be? So it's self-management.
And that's where we leave it. Thank you indeed for sharing your experiences with us, and of course talking about the possibilities of wonderful opportunities for young people watching us today. That was Layla Hassam talking to us about the life, or a day in the life, of an air traffic controller. And guys, if you haven't yet made up your mind what you're going to do post-matric or possibly post-uni, perhaps this is something you want to consider. Sounds very, very exciting to me. If I were a bit younger, who knows, this might have been an area I would have considered. But there you go, a wonderful area to be explored. Thank you for being with us on the show this morning. We do hope you've enjoyed the show, and a very, very big thank you to the Let's Talk production team. Till Saturday morning, as always, please take care, and it is Khuda Hafiz from me, Julie Alli.
Ya hala, 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 ya hala. حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا، حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا، يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا، يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا، يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا.